Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. I grew up car camping all over Tennessee, spending weekends at every state park my parents could reach on a tank of gas. But last fall marked my first time taking my younger brother Tim and his fiancée Lauren on a real backpacking overnight. The kind where you carry everything on your back and sleep miles from the nearest road. We planned it carefully, doing everything by the book. I filled out the permit application at Cosby Campground 3 days in advance, paid the fee, and left our itinerary with the office. Our car sat parked by the trailhead kiosk with the dashboard permit visible through the windshield. The route I'd chosen ran up the Low Gap Trail along Cosby Creek to one of the designated backcountry sites, a reasonable distance for first-timers carrying full packs. It was late October, that narrow window when the weather sits perfectly balanced between seasons. Cold enough that morning frost made the footbridge boards slick under our boots. Warm enough by afternoon that you could unzip your jacket on the climbs and feel actual sweat cooling on your neck. The campground parking lot was half empty. Most of the RVs and family campers had cleared out after the leaf-peeping tourists went home. The air had that dry, earthy smell you only get when the color is past peak and the trees are thinning out, dropping their leaves in earnest now. I wanted Tim and Lauren to have a gentle first trip, cook simple meals on the camp stove, hear the creek running at night, see how quiet the Smokies get once you walk more than a mile from any road. We started up the trail around noon, our packs settled and our legs fresh. The path climbed gradually through second-growth hardwoods, crossing the creek twice on solid log bridges. Tim kept stopping to take photos of the water running over smooth stones, and Lauren pointed out mushrooms growing from rotting logs. I was pleased. This was exactly the kind of easy, beautiful day I'd hoped to show them. About a half-mile before our designated campsite, my trekking pole caught on something I never saw coming. The pole flexed sideways with a harsh scraping sound, and a small bell, maybe thumb-sized, gave one flat metallic note that cut through the ambient forest sounds like a knife. The tone hung in the air for a moment, then faded. I stopped walking immediately. The bell hung at knee-height, almost invisible in the shadow cast by a thick rhododendron. Someone had run monofilament fishing line between two young saplings and tied the bell to a carefully formed loop in the line. We all crouched around it like we were examining a leak under a sink, suddenly very aware of how still the woods had become. No bird song, no breeze moving the remaining leaves, just the distant sound of the creek and our own breathing. The line was too clean and taut to be old trash, and the setup was too purposeful to be random. The saplings had been chosen for their position, right at the natural walking height where a pole or a boot might brush the line. I eased the monofilament off my trekking pole with 2 fingers, moving slowly, and set it back exactly how we'd found it, the bell hanging motionless. "What was that?" Tim asked, his voice lower than normal. "Trail marker, maybe," I said, not believing it myself, or someone's weird art project. We walked on, but the easy mood had broken. 10 minutes later, we hit another setup. This one was a coffee can with pebbles inside, strung on more fishing line so it would rattle loudly if you brushed the thread. The can sat right at shin height, stretched across a faint side path that branched off from the main trail. The path looked old and overgrown, not officially maintained. "What is that for?" Lauren asked, stopping well short of the line. I said something about deer spoiling, that maybe someone was trying to keep animals away from a specific area, because I didn't want to say what I was actually thinking, which was that someone had built an early warning system. Someone who wanted advance notice of people moving around out here, people approaching from specific directions. We stepped over the line carefully, one at a time, and I used a stick to push it back into position after we'd all cleared it. Then we kept going because the sun was already flattening out behind the western ridge, and I didn't want to be setting up camp in full darkness. We reached our designated campsite without seeing another soul on the trail. The site was one of the smaller, quieter ones, not listed in the popular guides, just a couple of flat dirt pads worn down to mineral soil, a crude fire ring someone had built from creek stones, and a clearing just large enough for 2 tents if you didn't mind sleeping close. We ignored the fire ring entirely. I'd brought a camp stove, and open fires draw attention. The site had a solid oak branch about 15 feet up that would work perfectly for a bear hang, and Cosby Creek ran clean and cold about 30 yards downslope through a stand of hemlocks. We fell into the routine I'd practiced on solo trips. Pitch the tent on the flattest pad. Guy lines tight in vestibule facing away from prevailing wind. Hang the food bag on a branch far from camp using the counterbalance method. One bag with food, one bag with rocks, tossed over the branch and balanced so neither touches the ground. Filter 2 liters of water from the creek through my pump system, the kind that takes out everything dangerous. Boil water on the camp stove for dehydrated meals, the kind that come in pouches and reconstitute with hot water. The air had that clear cold edge that makes aluminum pots ring a little when you set them down on rock. The plan was simple. Eat dinner while there was still some light, take a short walk to scout the trail exit we'd use in the morning, and be zipped into the tent by full dark. We ate chicken teriyaki and rice from foil pouches, drank instant coffee, and watched the sky turn from blue to purple to deep violet between the tree branches. That was easier than I thought, Tim said, scraping the last of his meal from the pouch. I thought backpacking would be harder. Wait until you're carrying the pack uphill in July, I said. Then tell me how easy it is. Lauren stood and stretched, rolling her shoulders. Should we take that walk now, before it gets too dark? We followed a narrow footpath that led behind our campsite. A trail that looked like it paralleled the main route we'd come in on. I wanted to confirm where it rejoined the main trail so we wouldn't waste time in the morning. The path was less maintained than the official trail, with more roots crossing the packed dirt and branches hanging lower. We walked single file, me in front with my headlamp already around my neck in case we needed it. About 200 yards from camp, deep in a rhododendron thicket under those thick, shiny evergreen leaves, I spotted something that didn't belong. A square of dark green tarp had been tucked carefully into the brush and dusted with leaf litter to break up its outline. The corners were weighted down with smooth river rocks, the kind you'd find in the creek bed. I stopped walking and held up one hand. Tim and Lauren came up beside me, and we all stared at the tarp for a long moment. "Should we look?" Lauren whispered. "We should leave it alone," I said. But I was already kneeling down, because not knowing felt worse than knowing. I lifted one corner of the tarp carefully. Underneath, the soil was dark and freshly turned, mounded in 4 distinct lumps about the size of small loaves of bread. The dirt had that rich, damp smell of earth that's been recently disturbed. Sitting beside the mounds was a burlap sack tied shut with paracord, the kind of general-purpose cord you can buy at any outdoor store. I loosened the knot just enough to peek inside without fully opening it. The sack was full of roots. Knobby, tan-colored roots with thin feeder hairs still attached and clumps of dirt clinging to them. The smell that came from the sack was sharp, green, and medicinal. Distinctive if you know what to look for. Ginseng roots. Wild ginseng, the kind that grows slowly in old forests and can sell for serious money to buyers who ship it overseas for traditional medicine. Harvesting any plant in a national park is illegal. Period. No exceptions. People do it anyway because a single mature ginseng root can sell for hundreds of dollars. And a good haul can bring in thousands. Poachers scout remote areas, dig up the roots and stash them until they can carry them out without being seen. The fresh soil told me this cache was recent, probably dug within the last day or two. We didn't touch anything else. I put the sack back exactly how I'd found it, retied the paracord with the same kind of knot, and pulled the tarp back over the mounds. We replaced the river rocks in their original positions, or as close as I could remember, and backed out of the rhododendron thicket the same way we'd entered, trying not to leave obvious footprints. There was a short, tense conversation right there in the dimming light about whether we should pack out immediately and report what we'd found. It was already getting dark in the drainage, that early mountain darkness that comes when the sun drops behind the ridges, even though the sky is still light overhead. Between fallen leaves and scattered blowdowns, hiking out would mean slow going on slippery ground with only headlamps for light. A turned ankle or a fall in the dark could turn a precaution into a real emergency. "We should leave," Lauren said, her voice tight. "This feels wrong." "It's almost dark," I said, looking at the sky. "We'd be hiking blind in 30 minutes. So we stay here? Next to someone's illegal stash?" Tim asked. I thought about it, running through scenarios. We do a careful night. Strict bear protocol, even though this isn't about bears. We keep everything secure, stay alert, and leave at first light. Soon as there's enough light to see the trail clearly, we're gone. Tim looked at Lauren. She nodded slowly, though I could see she wasn't happy about it. We walked back to camp quickly and started preparations. I pulled everything out of the tent vestibule, our boots, the stuff sacks, everything, and arranged it so nothing could snag us if we needed to exit fast. I clipped the bear spray canister to my pack's shoulder strap where my right hand could find it instantly without looking, and I checked that the safety clip moved freely. We all put fresh batteries in our headlamps and tested the strobe modes, the kind that flash bright and disorienting. I kept the camp stove assembled and ready to light, knowing the roar of the burner could make noise if we needed to sound bigger and more present than 3 people. All our food and anything scented, toothpaste, deodorant, even chapstick went into the bear bag and got hung far from the tent. We brushed our teeth and spat the water well away from camp. We changed out of the clothes we'd cooked in and put those in the bear bag too. These weren't really bear precautions anymore. These were precautions against humans, against anyone who might come looking for their hidden cache and wonder who'd been walking around near it. We ate granola bars in silence as the last light faded, and I kept glancing back the way we'd come, watching the trail. The forest sounds were normal. Leaves rustling in a light breeze, the creek running steady, an owl calling from somewhere up the ridge. Then somewhere on the trail behind our camp, a bell chimed once. Just one clear note, bright and deliberate, then nothing. If you've spent time in the back country, you learn the difference between animal noise and human noise. Animals move with rhythm. Deer bound and stop, bound and stop. Raccoons rustle continuously through leaves. Birds call and answer. Human movement is different, more deliberate, more weighted. That bell wasn't an animal brushing a line. That was a person touching it, probably testing to see if anyone had disturbed their warning system. We killed the stove immediately, cutting off the hiss of the burner. We sat frozen, listening. The creek stayed steady. Leaves ticked and whispered as the air cooled and contracted. But no voices, no footsteps, nothing that would let us point and say there. We decided to get in the tent early, before full darkness settled in completely. We lined our boots up right outside the vestibule door, positioned so we could step directly into them without fumbling. We kept our headlamps on our foreheads but turned off. Everything we might need sat within arm's reach. The spray, the stove, the whistle I carried for emergencies. It got truly dark. The kind of darkness you don't get near roads or houses, where the nearest electric light is miles away, and the moon hasn't risen yet. Without moonlight, everything past the tent's thin nylon walls turned into the same formless dark. Not because something was wrong with it, just because light only carries so far through brush and tree trunks, and beyond that distance your eyes have nothing to work with. We lay there in our sleeping bags, not talking much. I was on my back, staring at the tent's ceiling, which I couldn't actually see. Tim was to my left, Lauren to my right. I could hear their breathing, slightly faster than normal. I was counting seconds in my head, though I'm not sure why. Maybe just to have something to focus on besides the darkness and the waiting. We were half asleep, or I was starting to drift anyway, when I heard footsteps on dry leaves. Slow, careful footsteps. The kind of deliberate pace you take when you're trying not to make much sound but can't avoid it entirely because dry leaves crunch no matter how carefully you step. The footsteps came from the direction of the main trail, moving toward our camp but stopping just short of where our tent sat. Then I heard voices, a man's voice and a woman's voice, speaking to each other in low, steady tones just outside the reach of our hearing. The words were too quiet to make out, but the rhythm was clear. One voice, then the other, like a normal conversation, except it wasn't normal, because they were having this conversation 20 feet from our tent in full darkness, and they hadn't announced themselves or called out a greeting. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin inside the tent. "Can we help you?" The voices stopped immediately. Complete silence, except for the creek. We waited, barely breathing. Then the voices started again, the same low murmur, still just out of clear hearing range. "Hello," Tim called, louder this time. "We're camped here. Can we help you?" Again, immediate silence. Then, after maybe 30 seconds, the voices resumed. It was like they were waiting for us to stop talking before they continued. Every time one of us called out, the voices went quiet and stayed quiet until we stopped. Then they picked up again, never quite loud enough for us to catch a full sentence. Not exactly whispering, and not normal conversation volume either. something in between, deliberately ambiguous. "This is wrong," Lauren whispered. "This is really wrong." I agreed. We'd already discussed what to do if something felt off, and now we needed to follow through. I unzipped the tent door and crawled out, my hands shaking slightly as I stepped into my boots. Tim and Lauren came out right behind me. We stood up together and moved into the formation we'd talked about, back to back in a tight triangle, so no one could approach from behind without one of us seeing. We all had our headlamps on, but we kept them on the lowest setting to preserve our night vision. Our hands stayed on the buttons, ready to switch to strobe mode instantly. I lit the camp stove, and it roared to life with that familiar pressurized hiss. The sound was louder than I expected in the quiet forest, and the heat radiating from the burner felt good against the cold air. I held the bear spray in my right hand with the safety clip off, but my finger carefully away from the trigger. The last thing I needed was to accidentally spray myself. I took a breath and spoke clearly, projecting my voice the way I'd learned in a wilderness first aid course. "We are camping at a permitted site. The campground host has our itinerary and knows exactly where we are. We will be leaving at first light to report what we found today. We don't want any trouble." For a moment, nothing. Then the woman's voice called from somewhere on the trail. Clearer now. "Help! He's hurt!" The words were distinct, but the tone was all wrong. There was no panic, no urgency, just a flat statement, like reading from a script. Before I could process it, the man's voice answered from a completely different angle, not from the same location as the woman, but off to our left, maybe 40 feet away. "Help! He's hurt!" The same words, the same inflection, like an echo. Except echoes don't have timing that precise, and they don't come from different locations. The voices kept moving. Every time we turned our headlamps toward the source of a sound, the footsteps shifted by a few yards, staying just outside the edge of our light. Leaves crunched once or twice, then nothing. I heard the coffee can rattle, a deliberate sound, like someone had shaken it gently with 2 fingers and then steadied it. I swept my headlamp across the brush to our right and caught a glint of something reflective. Another line of monofilament, this one strung between 2 short stakes that definitely hadn't been there when we'd set up camp. Someone had placed it while we were cooking dinner, while we were distracted and not paying attention to the perimeter. The line ran close to our tent, close enough that we could have tripped over it stepping out in the dark. The small bell we'd seen earlier on the trail gave a tiny metallic tick, not a full ring. Just the sound of the bell tapping against something and being steadied immediately by a hand. Someone was right there, close enough to touch the bell, close enough to see us clearly in the glow of the stove. I repeated louder this time. "We are staying right here until daylight. We will not approach you. We will leave at first light and report what we saw to the ranger station." The woman's voice called again, steady and calm. "Help! He's hurt!" The man echoed from another angle. "Help! He's hurt!" They were performing for us, testing to see if we'd break formation, if we'd run toward the voices in some misguided attempt to help, if we'd stumble over one of their lines in the dark, or get separated, or panic and flee down the trail where they could control the terrain. We didn't move. The stove kept roaring, drowning out my heartbeat. I could feel Tim's shoulder pressing against mine harder than he probably realized, and I could hear Lauren's breathing, fast and shallow. We stood there in our little triangle of light, surrounded by darkness and voices that wouldn't resolve into people. We finally got back in the tent when the footsteps had been gone long enough that standing outside started to feel foolish. My legs were shaking from standing still in the cold, and my neck ached from constantly turning my head to scan the darkness. But we didn't relax. We kept our boots on, laced tight. Headlamps stayed around our necks, batteries fresh. The bear spray canister sat between my knees where I could grab it in less than a second. The tent's nylon walls felt like tissue paper. I was acutely aware of how thin the material was, how little it would do to stop anything or anyone. It was just colored fabric and some aluminum poles. The illusion of shelter. We lay there in the darkness, trying to control our breathing, listening to every sound. We stayed quiet for maybe 15 minutes. The forest had gone still again. No voices, no footsteps, just the background rush of the creek and the occasional tick of cooling tree branches. I was starting to think maybe they'd left. Maybe they'd decided we weren't worth the effort. Then I heard breathing. Someone was standing just behind my head, on the other side of the tent wall. I could hear the soft sound of air moving in and out of lungs, slow and controlled. The fabric moved slightly, disturbed by the current of exhaled breath. Then a voice spoke, low and close enough that I could have been having a conversation with someone lying next to me. Not loud at all. You saw it. The words were matter of fact. Not threatening, exactly. Just stating something obvious. Confirming that we'd found their cache. That they knew we'd found it. That this whole night was about that single fact. Then I heard the sound of the tent zipper being pulled. The metal slider scraped along the teeth, moving slowly, and I felt the door panel start to open. Whoever was outside didn't seem to understand the mechanics. The zipper caught halfway, snagged on the little rain flap that covers the slider. They tugged harder, and the whole tent shook. I hit the strobe button on my headlamp. The inside of the tent erupted in harsh white light, flashing 3 times a second. Tim and Lauren did the same with theirs. The tent became a strobing box of disorienting brightness. I yelled. No words, just a loud shout, and lurched toward the door. Whoever had been there moved fast. I heard footsteps crash through the leaves, heavy and close, running low to the ground. The person was heading away from the tent, back toward the trail. Right after that I heard a sharp twang, the sound of monofilament snapping under tension. They'd moved one of their tripwires so close to our vestibule that it was right outside the door. We would have hit it if we'd stepped out quickly without a light. From down the trail, maybe 50 yards away, the woman's voice called out clearly, "We're leaving." A moment later, the man's voice responded from a different angle. The same distance away, "We're leaving." The same script, the same flat delivery, and then nothing. No footsteps retreating, no sounds of movement, just the statement hanging in the air, and we had no way to know if it was true or just another test. We didn't answer them. We sat there in the tent with our strobing headlamps still flashing until I realized we were just draining the batteries. I turned mine off, and Tim and Lauren followed. We switched to the regular setting and did slow, methodical sweeps of the area outside the tent every 10 minutes, looking for movement or reflected eyes or anything that would tell us where they were. The temperature kept dropping. I could feel it through my sleeping bag, that deep cold that makes the tent fabric go stiff and your breath come out in visible clouds. We traded watch shifts without saying much more than "your turn," and a hand on the shoulder. When it wasn't my turn to watch, I didn't sleep. I just lay there with my eyes closed, listening to every sound and trying to determine if it was natural or human-made. Somewhere around what I guessed was 2 or 3 in the morning. I couldn't check my phone because the light would ruin my night vision. I heard 2 sharp notes from a whistle. The sound came from way down the drainage, back toward the trailhead, maybe a half-mile away. 2 quick blasts, clear and deliberate, then nothing at all but the creak. I didn't know what the whistle meant. A signal between the 2 people. A message to someone else we hadn't seen? Or just another element of their performance? Another thing to make us uncertain and afraid? I added it to the mental list of details I was keeping. The things I'd need to report when we got out. When the sky started to change from pure black to that flat, dark gray that means dawn is coming, I made the call. "We're packing out," I whispered, "right now." We broke camp like we were fleeing a wildfire. I've never packed that fast in my life, and I've done plenty of quick exits from campsites when weather turned bad. Sleeping bags got stuffed into their sacks in seconds, still damp with condensation. We shook the tent once to get the worst of the moisture off, then rolled it wet and crammed it into its bag without bothering to fold it properly. The camp stove and our cook pot got thrown into the top of my pack without cleaning. The food bag came down from its hang, and I lashed it to my pack's exterior without bothering to sort anything or repack. I was moving so fast, being so rough with the gear, that I cut my index finger on the sharp end of a monofilament leader near one of the stakes. The slice was small but clean, the kind of cut that bleeds more than you'd expect. The cold air made it bleed freely, and I had to wrap it quickly with athletic tape from my first aid kit. My hands were shaking as I wound the tape, though whether from cold or adrenaline or fear, I couldn't say. We moved. No discussion about the route, no checking the map. We just followed the main trail back the way we'd come, moving as fast as the terrain would allow in the dim pre-dawn light. We didn't talk except to call out obstacles. Route, slick spot, branch overhead. The 2-mile walk back to the trailhead felt like 6. Every sound behind us made me want to look over my shoulder, but I forced myself to keep eyes forward to watch the trail and not trip. We passed 2-day hikers coming up near the lower switchbacks, probably hoping to catch the sunrise from the ridge. They said good morning cheerfully, and we returned the greeting without stopping. We must have looked like hell, pale, exhausted, moving too fast. But they didn't ask questions, and we didn't volunteer information. The first full sunlight hit the gravel parking lot just as we stepped off the footbridge. Our car sat exactly where we'd left it, covered in dew, the permit still visible on the dashboard. The sight of it, that ordinary blue sedan with a dent in the rear quarter panel, made something loosen in my chest. We threw our packs in the trunk without bothering to organize anything and drove straight to the campground host station. The host was an older man named Mr. Brennan, a retired park ranger who'd been volunteering at Cosby for years. He looked up from his coffee when we walked in, and his expression changed immediately. "What happened?" "We need to report something," I said. "We found an illegal dig site. Ginseng, I think. And people came to our camp last night. They tried to scare us off." Mr. Brennan didn't act surprised. He set down his coffee carefully and picked up the radio. "This on the Low Gap Trail?" "Yes, sir. About a half mile before Site 12. He radioed for a ranger, gave our location, and told us to sit at the picnic table outside and drink some water. My hands were still shaking more than I wanted them to. Lauren sat close to Tim, and he had his arm around her shoulders. We didn't talk. We just sat there in the morning sun, which felt impossibly bright and warm and normal after the night we'd had. When Ranger Simmons arrived 20 minutes later, we gave him our permit number and all our information. Then we walked him back into the forest. Daylight turns the same ground into a completely different place. The trail that had felt dark and threatening looked like an ordinary park trail. Rocky, a little muddy, lined with rhododendrons. We pointed out the first bell line, and Ranger Simmons photographed it from multiple angles before carefully cutting the monofilament and placing it in an evidence bag. We showed him the coffee can setup, and he did the same documentation process. When we reached the side path to the rhododendron thicket, he had us wait on the main trail while he examined the approach. He was looking for footprints, for signs of how many people had been moving through this area. He found scuff marks in the leaves, partial boot prints in soft soil, and what looked like drag marks where something heavy had been pulled through the underbrush. He didn't let us touch the tarp this time. He photographed it in place, then lifted it himself, wearing latex gloves from his pack. He documented the fresh soil mounds, the burlap sack, the small hand scale sitting beside it, and a short digging tool with fresh dirt still clinging to the blade. He wanted us to describe exactly what we'd seen the day before, but not to handle anything. Everything went into evidence bags. The sack, the scale, the tool, even samples of the disturbed soil. On the way back out, Ranger Simmons stopped near where our tent had been pitched. He pointed to a scuffed spot in the leaves, a place where the ground cover had been disturbed recently. They tripped their own line, he said, and laughed once without any humor in it. Probably in the dark, coming up to your tent. See here? He pointed to a broken piece of monofilament tied to a thin stake. They reset it, but not quite right. He didn't give us a lecture about what we should have done differently. Instead, he said we'd made exactly the right calls. Not moving in the dark, not trying to confront anyone, not attempting to take the illegal cash down to the campground ourselves. He said he'd been dealing with a specific pair of local poachers who used noise rigs and voice tactics to clear people from certain areas of the park. He didn't give us their names, said it was an ongoing investigation. He asked us to write down everything we remembered while it was still fresh, even the parts that felt like nothing, the timing of sounds, the exact phrasing of what the voices had said, the placement of the tripwires. He thanked us, which felt strange because I didn't feel like we'd done anything particularly helpful or brave. I felt like we'd been given a very clear message to leave, and we'd left. 2 days later, Ranger Simmons called my cell phone. His voice sounded lighter than it had on the trail. "Wanted to let you know we made contact," he said. "Got them the next evening, couple miles from where you camped." Another hiker reported the lines across the trail and called it in. "Did you find them?" I asked. "Man and a woman, both local. We'd been watching them for a while, but never had enough for charges. Your report gave us what we needed. Citations issued for ginseng poaching, criminal trespass, and interfering with park visitors. The routes matched fresh dig sites we documented, and we found the bells and the coffee can in their truck." He didn't ask us to come in for anything else. He said our names were in the incident report as witnesses, and told us again that leaving at first light had been the right call. They were counting on you running, he said. In the dark on unfamiliar trail. That's when people get hurt. You stayed put and waited for daylight. That's exactly what you should have done. We got out with a sliced finger that healed in a week and a night. I still don't like to think about when I'm trying to fall asleep. There wasn't anything supernatural about what happened to us. It was two people who didn't want witnesses near their illegal operation. They knew the park, knew the trails, knew how to use darkness and sound and fear to push visitors away from areas they wanted clear. They paced the edge of our light, moved their alarm systems closer to our camp, tried to pull us off the tent pad with a simple script that mimicked an emergency, and came right up to our tent to make sure we understood that they knew we'd seen too much. I keep going over the same details in my mind. The way the bell gave a single note and then went quiet, like someone had steadied it with their hand. The coffee can rattling right after they spoke, timed for maximum effect. The tent zipper catching on the rain flap because the hand pulling it had never opened that particular model of tent before and didn't know the trick. The whistle from down the drainage at 3 in the morning, signaling something we'd never understand. I tell myself we did everything simple and right. We stayed together. We didn't chase voices into the darkness. We used our gear for what it was designed for. We left the illegal activity for the people with badges and cameras and legal authority. And when I talk to Tim and Lauren now, when they mention that trip, I remind them that the scariest thing out there that night wasn't the place itself. The Smokies are beautiful and indifferent, just mountains and trees and creeks running cold. The scary thing was two people who wanted us very far away and were willing to work methodically and patiently to make that happen. That's what I remember most. Not fear of the unknown, but the cold certainty that we were being managed, moved, herded away from something we'd accidentally found, and the discipline it took to stand still, keep the light on, and wait for dawn. Lake of the Woods had always been my refuge, a sprawling frozen wilderness spanning the border between Minnesota and Ontario. For 37 years I'd made the pilgrimage each winter, drilling through thick ice in search of walleye and solitude. My wife used to join me in the early years, but she'd always preferred the cabin near Baudette during the warmer months, where mosquitoes replaced the biting wind and the lake shimmered green instead of white. When the cancer finally took her last July, the world lost its color. Everything became muted, distant, as if I were watching my own life through frosted glass. This winter I needed the ice more than ever. I needed to disappear into that vast emptiness where the only sounds were the wind and the occasional crack of shifting ice, where no one would ask how I was doing with that pitying look in their eyes, where I could simply exist without the weight of sympathy pressing down on my shoulders. I loaded my equipment onto the sled at dawn on February 16, 2025. My breath forming thick clouds in the sub-zero air. The preparations were automatic after so many years. The gas-powered ice auger with its freshly sharpened blades. The portable propane heater that had kept me alive through countless frigid nights. My old army cot with its threadbare canvas. 2 Coleman lanterns with extra mantles. A week's worth of canned soup and beans. 5 gallons of drinking water. Spare fuel canisters and the emergency kit I'd assembled decades ago and never needed. The drive across the ice was hauntingly beautiful. The February sun hung low and pale, casting long shadows across the frozen expanse. The landscape was a study in white and gray, interrupted only by the dark silhouettes of pine-covered islands jutting up through the ice like the backs of sleeping giants. My snowmobile's engine roared across the silence, the sled bouncing along behind, laden with everything I needed to survive in isolation. I headed for Devil's Elbow, a remote chain of small islands far from the ice fishing resorts that dotted the more accessible parts of the lake. Most fishermen avoided the area, claiming the fishing wasn't worth the distance, but I'd always found the isolation more valuable than any catch. Out here you could spend days without seeing another soul, surrounded by nothing but ice, sky, and the occasional raven circling overhead. The ice was solid, nearly 2 feet thick in most places. I'd been checking ice conditions all winter, monitoring the freeze through local reports and my own careful observations. Still, I stopped every few hundred yards to drill test holes, watching the auger bite through layers of white and blue ice before hitting the dark water beneath. Safety had been drilled into me by old-timers who'd lost friends to the lake's deceptive surface. Ice fishing wasn't a hobby for the careless. I reached my destination by mid-morning, selecting a spot near the southern tip of the largest island in the Devil's Elbow chain. The location was perfect, sheltered from the worst winds by the island's pines, yet far enough from shore to access the deeper channels where walleye congregated. I drilled my fishing hole with practiced efficiency, the auger screaming through the ice in a shower of white chips. 18 inches of good clear ice, more than enough to support my shack and equipment. Setting up the portable ice shack took less than 20 minutes. The canvas walls went up quickly, secured by aluminum poles and anchored with ice screws. Inside, I arranged my gear with the efficiency of long practice. Cot against the back wall, heater near the fishing hole, lanterns hung from the ceiling supports, supplies stacked neatly in the corner. By noon, I had a line in the water and coffee brewing on my small camp stove. The first afternoon passed in comfortable routine. I caught 3 decent perch and 1 small walleye. Nothing spectacular, but enough to justify the trip. As the sun began its early descent, painting the western sky in shades of orange and pink, I cooked a simple dinner of canned beef stew heated over the propane burner. The familiar ritual brought a measure of peace I hadn't felt since the funeral. That first night I slept better than I had in months. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the faint glow of the heater's pilot light. The silence was profound, interrupted occasionally by the distant crack of shifting ice, a sound as natural to me as my own heartbeat. I dreamed of nothing, or at least nothing I remembered, and woke feeling more rested than I had since my wife's diagnosis. The second day began with promise. I woke to pale morning light filtering through the canvas walls, my breath visible in the cold air despite the heater's efforts. After a breakfast of instant oatmeal and black coffee, I decided to explore the northern part of the island chain. An old friend, Jim Barrett, had maintained a fishing shack up there for years before his arthritis forced him south to Arizona. I hadn't been to his spot in at least 3 seasons, but I remembered it as prime walleye territory. The ride north was exhilarating, the snowmobile's engine echoing off the surrounding islands as I navigated between ice ridges and pressure cracks. The morning air was crystalline and sharp, burning my lungs with each breath. After about 20 minutes, I spotted Jim's old shack, a weathered plywood structure that looked even more dilapidated than I remembered. I circled the shack once before parking, noting that the door hung slightly ajar, unusual given Jim's meticulous nature. But the structure had been abandoned for years now. Weather and time had likely taken their toll. Still, curiosity drew me forward, boots crunching through the crusty snow as I approached the entrance. The shack was empty, as expected, but surprisingly intact inside. Jim's old fishing gear still hung from rusty nails, covered in a thin layer of frost. His battered Coleman cooler sat in the corner, lid closed, probably empty or filled with ancient frozen bait. The place smelled of old canvas and motor oil, familiar scents that brought back memories of shared fishing trips and stories told over warming whiskey. On impulse, I decided to drill a hole near Jim's old spot and try my luck. The ice here was nearly as thick as at my own location, and within an hour I'd caught 2 beautiful walleye, each over 20 inches long. The fishing gods were smiling on me. I made a mental note of the location, planning to return the next day with proper gear to preserve the catch. By early afternoon, clouds had begun rolling in from the northwest, heavy and gray, promising either snow or the kind of bitter cold that could turn dangerous quickly. The temperature had already dropped noticeably, and the wind was picking up, sending loose snow skittering across the ice in ghostly patterns. I decided to head back to my own shack while visibility was still good. The return trip felt longer than the morning journey, though I knew it was just my imagination responding to the deteriorating weather. By the time I reached my shack, the sun had disappeared entirely behind the cloud cover, leaving the world in a flat, colorless twilight despite it being only mid-afternoon. I spent the rest of the daylight hours inside, organizing gear and preparing dinner. The wind intensified as evening approached, buffeting the canvas walls and making the lanterns swing gently on their hooks. I ate mechanically, reading a worn paperback Western novel I'd brought along, trying to focus on the story but finding my thoughts drifting back to my empty house, to the medical bills still piled on the kitchen table, to the silence that had replaced my wife's voice. Darkness came early and absolute. I extinguished one lantern to conserve fuel, leaving just enough light to read by. The wind continued its assault on the shack, and somewhere in the distance, ice groaned and cracked as the temperature plummeted. These were familiar sounds, the lake's normal voice, and they lulled me toward sleep as I lay on the narrow cot, still fully dressed except for my boots. I'm not sure what time it was when I woke, but the darkness was complete. My lantern had burned out, leaving me in pitch blackness. The heater's pilot light provided barely enough glow to see my own hands. For a moment I lay disoriented, trying to remember where I was and what had disturbed my sleep. Then I heard it again, the sound that had pulled me from unconsciousness. Footsteps, clear and unmistakable, crunching through the crusty snow outside my shack. My first thought was relief. Another fisherman, perhaps checking on me during this cold snap. The isolation of Devil's Elbow made it customary for those few hardy souls who ventured out here to check on each other, especially in severe weather. I started to sit up, ready to call out a greeting. But something stopped me. Some primitive instinct that had kept my ancestors alive long enough to pass on their genes. The footsteps were wrong somehow. They moved too slowly, too deliberately, as if whoever was walking was carefully measuring each step, and they were heavy, impossibly heavy, each step producing a deep crunch that seemed too pronounced even for someone in heavy winter boots. I remained frozen on my cot, listening intently. The footsteps circled the shack slowly, methodically, making a complete circuit before stopping directly behind where I lay. Through the canvas wall, I could sense a presence, something large and utterly still, standing just inches away. My heart hammered against my ribs. I wanted to call out, to demand identification, to break the terrible tension, but something kept my voice locked in my throat. Instead, I eased myself quietly off the cot and crept toward the small observation window I'd cut into the canvas. A 6-inch square covered with clear plastic that allowed me to check weather conditions without opening the door. I pressed my face close to the plastic, cupping my hands around my eyes to block the faint glow from the heater. Outside, the night was bright with moonlight reflecting off the snow-covered ice. The visibility was remarkable, at least 100 yards in every direction. The ice was empty, completely, utterly empty. Yet the footsteps continued, now moving around toward the front of the shack. I could hear them clearly, heavy and measured, accompanied now by a strange dragging sound, as if something was being pulled across the ice. The combination was unnerving in a way I couldn't articulate. I stumbled toward the door flap, fumbling for my flashlight with shaking hands. Part of me knew that opening that door was a mistake, but panic was beginning to override reason. I needed to see what was out there, to confirm with my own eyes that I wasn't losing my mind. My hand was on the zipper when the footsteps stopped again. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been. I stood frozen, flashlight clutched in one hand, listening so intently that my ears began to create phantom sounds in the void. Then came a single deliberate knock against the canvas wall. Not a bump or an accidental brush, but an unmistakable knock, 3 measured taps that could only have been made by knuckles against fabric. Terror flooded through me, pure and primal. I backed away from the door, retreating to the far corner of the shack where my cot stood. I grabbed the flare gun from my emergency kit, checking with trembling fingers that it was loaded. The weight of the weapon in my hand provided minimal comfort. The silence stretched on, becoming almost unbearable. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours. Time had lost meaning. I stood pressed against the back wall, flare gun aimed at the door, waiting for whatever was outside to enter. But nothing happened. Eventually, perhaps an hour later, I heard the footsteps resume, moving away from the shack, growing fainter until they disappeared entirely into the night. Still, I didn't move. I remained standing in the corner, gun ready, until the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the canvas walls. Morning brought no relief from the dread that had settled in my chest. As soon as there was enough light to see clearly, I forced myself to unzip the door and step outside. The cold air hit me like a physical blow, but I barely noticed. My attention was focused entirely on the snow-covered ice surrounding my shack. At first, I saw nothing unusual. The surface was pristine, marked only by my own tracks from the previous day, and the drag marks from where I'd pulled my sled into position. Relief began to wash over me. I'd imagined it all, a nightmare brought on by isolation and grief. There was no visitor, no mysterious footsteps, just an old man's mind playing tricks on him in the darkness. Then I circled around to the back of the shack, and my breath caught in my throat. Footprints. Large, deep impressions in the snow and ice, forming a complete circle around my shelter. Each print was elongated and bare, not the typical oval shape of a boot, but something more like a human foot stretched to impossible proportions. The prints sank deep into the crusty surface, requiring significant weight to create such impressions in ice-hardened snow. But it was where the prints began and ended that truly unsettled me. The trail started abruptly about 15 feet from my shack, as if whatever made them had simply materialized there. The prints circled my shelter completely, then stopped just as suddenly 20 feet away on the opposite side. No trail led to the circle's beginning, and none led away from its end. I stood staring at those prints for a long time, my mind refusing to accept what my eyes were showing me. I walked the perimeter several times, searching for some logical explanation. Perhaps the wind had erased portions of the trail, but the snow was packed and frozen, not the light powder that could be blown away easily. Perhaps another fisherman playing a prank, but the isolation of this location and the bitter cold made such a scenario absurdly unlikely. I knelt beside one of the prints, examining it closely. The impression was too deep and too detailed to be artificial. I could make out what appeared to be individual toe marks, 5 distinct depressions at the front of each footprint, but the proportions were all wrong. The print was nearly 16 inches long and 7 inches wide at its widest point, far larger than any human foot I'd ever encountered. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone to take photographs, though I knew the device was useless for anything else out here. No signal reached Devil's Elbow, but at least I could document what I was seeing. Part of me already knew that I would need evidence later, that no one would believe this story without proof. After taking several photos from different angles, I returned to my shack and tried to think clearly. My options were limited. I could pack up immediately and head back to the mainland, abandoning several days' worth of supplies and admitting defeat to whatever had visited me in the night. Or I could stay, try to maintain my routine, and hope that whatever had made those prints didn't return. Pride and stubbornness won out over caution. I'd faced blizzards, dangerous ice conditions, and equipment failures over my decades of ice fishing. I'd survived a war overseas and buried my wife of 43 years. I wasn't about to be run off by strange footprints and nighttime noises, no matter how unsettling. But I did take precautions. I spent the morning reinforcing my shack, adding extra ice screws to the anchors and double-checking all my equipment. I inventoried my supplies carefully, making sure I knew exactly what I had available for defense or emergency. The flare gun went back into my coat pocket where I could reach it quickly. I also laid out my hunting knife, a wicked 7-inch blade I'd carried since my army days, positioning it where I could grab it from the cot. By midday, I'd restored some sense of normalcy. The sun had emerged from behind the clouds, and the temperature had risen slightly, making the day almost pleasant. I drilled a new fishing hole closer to my shack and caught several nice crappies, focusing on the familiar routine to keep my mind from dwelling on the morning's discovery. Despite my determination to maintain normalcy, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. The sunlight helped, as did the simple act of fishing, but every shadow seemed to hold potential menace now. Every distant crack of ice made me flinch. I found myself constantly scanning the surrounding islands, looking for movement in the tree line. Around 2 in the afternoon, I made a decision that I would later recognize as profoundly foolish. I needed to see Jim Barrett's old shack again, to check if there were any similar disturbances there. Perhaps whatever had visited me had also investigated his abandoned shelter. Perhaps there would be some clue there, some explanation that would make sense of the previous night's events. The ride north felt different in daylight. The landscape that had seemed beautiful 2 days ago now appeared vaguely threatening. The island's dark pines seemed to lean toward the ice, their shadows reaching out like grasping fingers. I drove faster than was wise, the snowmobile's skis occasionally catching on rough ice patches, sending jarring vibrations up through my spine. Jim's shack appeared on the horizon sooner than I expected, but as I drew closer, something was clearly wrong. Even from a distance, I could see that the structure looked different from my visit the day before. I slowed the snowmobile, approaching cautiously, a tight knot of dread forming in my stomach. The front wall of the shack had been destroyed, not damaged by weather or time, but torn outward with tremendous force. Thick plywood panels hung in splinters, and the entire structure tilted at an angle, partially collapsed. I parked 50 feet away and approached on foot, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and leave. The damage was extensive and violent. The door had been ripped completely off its hinges and lay twisted on the ice 20 feet from the entrance. Deep gouges scarred what remained of the walls, long parallel scratches that looked like nothing so much as claw marks, though far larger than any bear could produce. I paused at the entrance, steeling myself before looking inside. What I saw there nearly made my knees buckle. The interior was a scene of savage destruction. Jim's old cot had been torn apart, its metal frame bent and twisted as if by incredible force. The canvas that had formed the sleeping surface was shredded into ribbons. His fishing gear had been scattered and broken. Poles snapped in half, tackle boxes crushed and scattered. But it was the blood that truly horrified me. Dark stains covered the wooden floor, splashed across the walls, and pooled in the corner where the cot had stood. Frozen solid by the intense cold, the blood had formed grotesque ice sculptures, crystalline structures that caught the light filtering through the damaged walls. There was too much of it, far too much. No one could lose that much blood and survive. Yet there was no body. Despite the clear evidence of violence, despite the massive quantities of blood, there was no corpse, no remains, nothing but the stains and the destruction. I backed out of the shack slowly, my mind reeling. My first thought was to contact the authorities, to report whatever had happened here. But my radio had no range from this location, and my phone remained useless. I would have to return to the mainland to get help, a journey that would take hours. As I stood there trying to decide on my next move, I noticed something that chilled me even more than the blood-soaked shack. A trail of the same elongated footprints I'd found around my shelter led from the destroyed structure toward the nearby island, disappearing into the dense pine forest, and lying in the snow near the tree line was a piece of torn, blood-stained fabric that looked disturbingly like it had come from a heavy winter coat. The return journey to my shack was a blur of panic and racing thoughts. I knew I should leave immediately, head for the mainland in safety, but darkness was already approaching, the sun sinking rapidly toward the horizon. The temperature was dropping again, and attempting a crossing of the lake's vast expanse in failing light was potentially suicidal. Slush pockets, pressure ridges, and open water channels were difficult enough to navigate in daylight. In darkness, they were deadly. I made it back to my shelter just as twilight was fading to night. My hands shook so badly that it took 3 tries to get the snowmobile parked properly. Inside the shack, I frantically began organizing my gear for a dawn departure. I would pack everything tonight, be ready to leave at first light, get to the ranger station, and report what I'd found. Let the professionals figure out what had happened to Jim's shack and to whomever had been staying there. The wind picked up as darkness fell, buffeting the canvas walls with renewed fury. I lit both lanterns, wanting as much light as possible, and turned the propane heater to its highest setting. The flare gun went under my pillow, and the hunting knife stayed in my hand. I tried to eat dinner, but couldn't force down more than a few bites of cold canned beans. Around 8 o'clock by my watch, I heard the sound again. A long, mournful howl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. It wasn't like any animal call I'd ever heard in my decades of outdoor experience. The sound was wrong, carrying a quality that bypassed my rational mind and went straight to some ancient primal part of my brain that knew only fear. The howl faded slowly, echoing across the frozen lake, and in the silence that followed, I became aware of my own ragged breathing. I moved to the observation window and pressed my face against the plastic, scanning the darkness outside. At first I saw nothing but the moon-washed ice stretching away toward the distant islands. Then movement caught my eye near the tree line of the closest island, perhaps 200 yards away. A shape stood there, tall and impossibly thin, its silhouette darker than the surrounding shadows. It was motionless, but I had the unmistakable impression that it was watching me, that whatever intelligence guided that form was focused entirely on my small, vulnerable shelter. I don't know how long I stood at that window, staring at the figure while it stared back. Minutes or hours, time had no meaning. My legs ached from standing, and my eyes burned from the strain of peering into the darkness, but I couldn't look away. Then, without any apparent movement, the figure was closer. Not walking, not running, just suddenly standing 50 yards nearer than it had been a moment before. The impossible transition broke something in my mind. I stumbled backward from the window, terror overwhelming rational thought. The footsteps began again. That same heavy, measured crunching I'd heard the previous night. They approached steadily, and I backed into the corner of the shack, flare gun raised with shaking hands. The knife lay on the cot, forgotten in my panic. The footsteps stopped directly outside the door. For an eternal moment, nothing happened. Then came that same deliberate knock, 3 measured taps against the canvas. "Go away," I shouted, my voice cracking. "Leave me alone!" Silence answered me, the kind of silence that feels alive, pregnant with potential. I stood trembling in the corner, gun aimed at the door, waiting for whatever came next. What came next was worse than any attack could have been. A soft sound, like fingernails dragging slowly down the canvas wall. The sound moved across the front of the shack, then along the side, then across the back, a complete circuit that took perhaps 30 seconds. When it finished, the silence returned, deeper and more oppressive than before. I stood frozen in that corner for the rest of the night, gun never wavering from the door, listening for any sound that might herald another visit. None came. As dawn finally began to gray the eastern sky, I was still standing there, exhausted and terrified but alive. I didn't waste time on breakfast or proper packing. As soon as there was enough light to see, I threw my essential gear onto the sled in a chaotic heap, not caring about organization or protecting equipment. Survival was my only priority now. I needed to reach the ranger station, needed to get off this ice and away from whatever was hunting me. The snowmobile started on the first pull, and I offered a silent prayer of gratitude. I'd heard horror stories of machines failing at critical moments, of fishermen stranded on the ice by mechanical problems, but my old Arctic cat had never let me down in 15 years, and it didn't fail me now. I pulled away from my campsite without looking back, opening the throttle as wide as I dared. The sled bounced and lurched behind me, inadequately secured, but I didn't care. Speed was everything now. The ranger outpost lay 12 miles south, across open ice and around several islands. In good conditions, the journey took about 40 minutes. Today I intended to make it in 30. For the first few miles, I allowed myself to believe I was going to make it. The morning was clear and cold, perfect conditions for travel. The ice was solid beneath my skis, and the snowmobile's engine ran smoothly. I focused on navigation, picking the safest route around pressure ridges and avoiding areas where slush might lurk beneath fresh snow. Then I made the mistake of checking my side mirror. Something moved behind me, a dark shape against the white expanse of ice. At first I thought it was a visual trick, perhaps a shadow cast by one of the islands. But the shape was moving, and it was moving fast. Far faster than any animal should be able to run across broken ice. I risked a quick glance over my shoulder, and what I saw nearly made me lose control of the snowmobile. A figure pursued me, running upright in a gait that was disturbingly human yet fundamentally wrong. It moved in great bounding strides, covering impossible distances with each step. Arms swung low at its sides, nearly reaching the ice with each forward swing. Even from this distance I could see that it was gaunt, impossibly thin, its body all sharp angles and protruding bones. Terror gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. I twisted the throttle to its maximum, the engine screaming in protest. The speedometer needle climbed past 50 miles per hour. A dangerous speed on ice, but I didn't care. Behind me, that thing maintained its pace, neither gaining nor falling back, simply pursuing with mechanical relentlessness. A sound reached me over the snowmobile's roar, a guttural cry that seemed to combine rage and hunger in equal measure. The thing chasing me was calling, and the sound it made drove ice picks of fear into my brain. Ahead I could see the channel that ran between 2 of the larger islands, a notorious spot where current kept the ice thinner than the surrounding areas. In summer, boats navigated this passage freely. In winter, experienced fishermen avoided it, but it was the shortest route to the ranger station, potentially saving me several critical minutes. I didn't hesitate. I aimed directly for the channel, praying that the ice would hold my weight. The snowmobile hit the thinner ice at full speed, and for a terrifying moment, I felt the surface flex beneath me. But it held, and I rocketed across the narrow passage in seconds. Looking back, I saw my pursuer reach the channel's edge and pause for the first time. It stood at the brink, that impossible figure, and for a moment I thought I'd escaped. Then it stepped onto the thin ice, and despite its obvious weight, the surface didn't crack. It resumed its chase as if walking on solid ground. In desperation, I fumbled for the flare gun in my pocket. nearly losing control of the snowmobile in the process. One-handed, I aimed back over my shoulder and fired. The flare streaked across the morning sky, a brilliant red arc that exploded in a shower of sparks above my pursuer. The thing flinched away from the bright light, arms raised to shield its face, and in that moment of distraction, I gained precious distance. Hope flared in my chest, and I focused everything on the route ahead, willing the machine beneath me to hold together just a little longer. That's when the ice gave way. I had no warning. One moment the snowmobile was racing across solid ice. The next it was plunging into a hidden slush pocket, the kind of saturated, semi-frozen mix that lies in wait beneath innocent-looking snow. The machine's skis dug into the slush like quicksand, bringing us to a violent, jarring stop. The sudden deceleration threw me forward over the handlebars. I hit the ice hard, the impact driving the air from my lungs. For a moment I lay stunned, unable to breathe, unable to think beyond the urgent need for oxygen. Behind me, the snowmobile's engine died with a sad sputter. Then survival instinct kicked in. I scrambled to my feet, gasping for air, and immediately felt the ice shift beneath me. Cracks radiated outward from the slush pocket, and dark water began seeping up through the growing fissures. I was standing on ice that was about to give way completely. The shoreline lay 30 yards ahead. In normal circumstances, a short walk. Now, with the ice fracturing beneath my feet and something pursuing me, it might as well have been miles. But I had no choice. I moved forward as quickly as I dared, each step sending new cracks spiderwebbing across the surface. Behind me, I heard the splash as the snowmobile broke through completely, vanishing into the frigid water below. 20 yards. I could see individual trees on the shoreline now, could make out the details of snow-covered rocks. Behind me, I heard the heavy footfalls of my pursuer growing closer. It had resumed the chase, apparently unbothered by the collapsing ice. 15 yards. A loud crack echoed across the lake as a major section of ice gave way behind me. I didn't dare look back. I could only move forward, arms windmilling for balance, boots breaking through the surface with every other step as the ice degraded beneath my weight. 10 yards. The footsteps behind me stopped, replaced by a shriek of pure rage that seemed to pierce straight through my skull. My legs burned with the effort of running through knee-deep slush, my clothes soaked and freezing. 5 yards. A final lunge carried me off the ice and onto solid ground. I collapsed into the snow, gasping, trembling, certain that I would feel claws tearing into my back at any moment. But the attack never came. Instead, I heard another sound. An engine, growing rapidly louder. A game warden's ATV appeared on the service trail that ran along the shore, drawn by the flare I'd fired minutes ago. The warden, a young man whose name I would later learn was Thomas Crawford, jumped from his vehicle and ran toward me, shouting questions I couldn't process. He wrapped an emergency blanket around my shoulders and helped me onto the back of his ATV. As we pulled away, I looked back toward the lake one final time. The ice where I'd nearly drowned was settling, chunks of broken surface floating in dark water, and standing at the edge of solid ice, barely visible in the morning glare, was a tall, impossibly thin figure watching us leave. 2 days later, after warming up at the ranger station and giving a statement that officials clearly didn't believe, I returned to the site with local authorities. The ice had refrozen overnight, erasing most evidence of my near drowning. My snowmobile was gone, presumably at the bottom of the lake. My abandoned shack and gear were never recovered. No one was willing to venture back to Devil's Elbow to retrieve them. But they found something else. Deep gouges in the ice, claw marks that trailed away from where I'd broken through, following my path to shore before vanishing completely. The marks were impossibly deep, as if something with tremendous strength had clawed its way across the frozen surface. No animal tracks accompanied them, just those parallel gouges, each one over an inch deep in solid ice. The local Ontario Provincial Police documented everything, took photographs, filed a report, but the investigation went nowhere. Jim Barrett's shack was examined and found to be severely damaged, but the blood I'd seen was attributed to an animal kill, possibly a deer that had been dragged there by wolves. The gouges in the ice near my escape site were labeled as unusual natural ice formations in the official report. I never returned to Lake of the Woods. Within a month I'd sold everything. The cabin near Baudette, all my fishing equipment, my spare snowmobile, everything that connected me to that place. I moved south, to a small town in Iowa where the winters are milder and the lakes are shallow and crowded. But the memories didn't fade. In the years since, I've heard other stories. Whispered accounts from local fishermen about disappearances around Devil's Elbow. About equipment found abandoned on the ice with no sign of the anglers who'd left them there. About strange tracks that appear and disappear with no logical explanation. About sounds in the night that don't match any known animal. I told my story once to an investigator from the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources. He listened carefully, took notes, and promised to look into it. 3 weeks later, I called to follow up and was told that no record existed of our conversation. The recording that was made during my interview had mysteriously vanished, and the investigator had been transferred to a different office 300 miles away. Official policy now discourages winter fishing around Devil's Elbow. Warning signs have been posted citing unstable ice conditions, though locals know the ice there is often more solid than in more popular fishing areas. Still, a few hardy souls venture out each winter, drawn by the promise of solitude and good fishing. Not all of them come back. I'm 73 years old now, and I don't have many winters left, but I've made peace with the knowledge that I'll never understand what I encountered on Lake of the Woods. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Some things that walk in the darkness are better left unknown. But on cold winter nights, when the wind howls and ice forms on my windows, I sometimes wake in the darkness, certain I can hear footsteps circling my house. Heavy, measured footsteps that crunch through frozen snow. And I lie there in my bed, hardly breathing, listening until dawn breaks and the sounds fade away. God help anyone who goes looking for answers on that frozen lake. Because some questions, once you start asking them, demand answers that no one should have to face. And Devil's Elbow keeps its secrets well, hidden beneath layers of ice and snow, waiting for the next curious soul who ventures too far into the frozen wilderness, seeking solitude and finding something far more terrible instead. This happened in the 1990s, to be exact. The air was sticky that day, the kind that makes you regret stepping outside in the first place. My name's Frank Holbrook. I'd been living off the grid in Montana since 1987, away from everything, away from the job I hated and the people who thought I needed to be social. Not for me, I preferred the quiet. The isolation helped me think, and besides, I didn't need much more than my dog Scout and a wood stove. Funny though, despite being off the map, trouble has a way of finding you, no matter where you are. It was early June, when everything changed. I'd been running traps near the river, nothing too fancy, just trying to make some cash off beaver pelts. It wasn't anything glamorous, but it put food on the table. That morning I was about 2 miles out from my cabin, Scout pacing around my feet like he usually did. He was a good dog, better than most people honestly. But that day he was acting strange. He kept sniffing the air, whining under his breath. I'm not superstitious, but when a dog like Scout starts acting up, you pay attention. It wasn't long after that when I first smelled it. Now if you've ever gutted a deer, you know the kind of smell I'm talking about. Rot, decay, the kind of thing that makes your stomach churn. But this was worse. It was like the air was soaked in death. I figured a bear had gotten to one of my traps and left something to rot. I never imagined what I'd actually find. I pressed forward, pushing through the underbrush until I saw it. A body, or what was left of one. My first thought was a bear had mauled a hunter, but the more I looked, the less sense that made. A bear wouldn't have torn someone up like this, at least not in such a deliberate way. This was something else. The remains were scattered in a circle, like pieces of a broken puzzle. I'm no forensic expert, but the cuts looked clean. Too clean for a bear or wolf. There wasn't much left that was identifiable, but the way the body was laid out felt deliberate, like it had been arranged. The thought that this could be a person's doing crossed my mind. But who the hell would do something like that? And out here no less. I looked around, trying to find anything at all that could explain it. That's when I saw the tracks. They weren't bear tracks, not even close. They looked more like a dog's, but bigger, much bigger. And they were more than one set, crisscrossing through the brush like whatever made them had been pacing around the body. Scout started barking wildly, his hackles raised. He darted back and forth in front of me, growling. Not his usual bark, but something deeper, more primal. I crouched down and put a hand on his neck to calm him. but it didn't do much. His muscles were stiff, like he was ready to bolt at any second. I stood up, took one last look at the mess, and decided to get the hell out of there. I wasn't armed, stupid. I know, but I hadn't planned on anything more dangerous than trapping that morning. My cabin wasn't far, and I figured I could at least grab my rifle before I went to report this to the sheriff's office. But something about the tracks stuck with me. They were too fresh, like whatever made them hadn't gone far. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling the weight of something watching me. Every snap of a branch, every shift of the trees, it made my skin crawl. I knew I wasn't alone, but I didn't see anything. Yet, the smell though, it lingered, like whatever had done this was still out there, somewhere close. When I reached the cabin, I slammed the door behind me and grabbed my rifle from the wall. I wasn't about to go back out there alone, not with whatever that was lurking around. I debated for a moment whether to call the sheriff now or after I checked things out myself. It wasn't like I had a phone that worked out there, anyway. The closest signal was a 2-hour drive. That's when I heard it, not far off, a low scraping sound like something big dragging itself through the brush. Scout heard it too. His ears pricked, but he didn't bark this time. He just stared at the door, tail between his legs. I held the rifle tight, creeping toward the window to get a look. What I saw didn't make sense at first. It was huge, whatever it was, but hunched over like it was walking on all fours. It wasn't a bear, though. Its body was wrong, more like a cat in the way it moved, fluid and deliberate. But its head was twisted with teeth like jagged shards of glass. It looked wrong, like nature had put it together in a hurry and got bored halfway through. I should have shot it right then and there, but I froze. I've hunted plenty of big game, but nothing like this. And then it saw me. Before I could even think, the thing barreled toward the cabin. I barely had time to slam the door shut before it hit, hard enough to rattle the windows. Scout was growling now, teeth bared, but even he was smart enough to back off. The thing slammed into the cabin again, making the whole place shake. I backed up, rifle raised, my heart pounding so hard I thought it had burst out of my chest. The door wasn't going to hold, and I knew it. I was trapped. And whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to stop until it got inside. I aimed the rifle at the door, ready to fire the second it broke through. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to focus. Just as it hit the door a third time, I pulled the trigger. The sound was deafening, the recoil slamming into my shoulder. The thing let out this ungodly sound, like nothing I'd ever heard before. I fired again, then again, until the magazine was empty. Silence. For a moment I thought maybe I'd killed it. But then the door creaked open, hanging off its hinges. I stared at the mess, expecting to see the thing lying there, but all I saw was blood. Thick, dark blood pooling in the dirt outside. But the thing, it was gone. I ran to the door, rifle in hand, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. There was nothing, just the blood trail leading into the woods. I had two choices. I could follow it, or I could leave and never look back. I didn't know if it was smart or just plain stupid, but I grabbed my extra ammo, reloaded, and followed the trail. Scout stayed close to my side, growling softly, his eyes darting around like he expected the thing to jump out at any second. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that whatever it was, it knew I was coming. The blood trail led deeper into the forest, down into a ravine I'd never bothered to explore before. It was darker here, the trees growing thicker, their branches twisting together like skeletal fingers. I could barely see 10 feet in front of me, but the smell, the same rotten stench from earlier, it was getting stronger. I heard something behind me, a snap, like a twig breaking underfoot. I whipped around, rifle raised, but saw nothing. Scout was growling again, low and steady, his fur standing on end. Then I saw it. It moved between the trees, barely visible, but its shape, I knew it was the same thing from before. And it wasn't alone. There were 3 of them now, circling us. I raised the rifle and fired, but they were too fast. One of them lunged at me, its claws tearing through my shirt, but I managed to shove it back, firing again. The bullet hit, but it didn't slow the thing down. Another one came at me from the side, and Scout jumped at it, biting and snarling, but they were too strong, too fast. I didn't have a choice. I ran deeper into the ravine, the sounds of them chasing me, echoing through the trees. Scout was behind me, still fighting, but I couldn't turn back. I didn't know where I was going, just away from them. Suddenly, the ground beneath me gave way, and I fell. When I came to, everything was quiet. Too quiet. My leg throbbed, and when I looked down I saw the blood, but it wasn't mine. It was Scout's. I staggered to my feet, the pain in my leg nearly blinding me. I looked around, but there was no sign of the creatures, just Scout's body lying in the dirt. He'd saved me, but it had cost him everything. I stood there, rifle in hand, not knowing what to do next. That's when I saw it, standing at the edge of the ravine, watching me. But this time, it didn't charge. It stood there, almost as if it was thinking. I gripped the rifle tighter, my hands slick with sweat and blood, but I didn't fire. We stared at each other for what felt like minutes, though it was probably just seconds. The thing's chest heaved with labored breaths, dark blood trickling from a wound in its side where I must have hit it earlier. And then I noticed something that made my stomach churn. There were human bones scattered around the ravine. Some old, some recent. This wasn't just some random hunting ground. This was a den. I glanced back at the creature. It wasn't just mindlessly attacking. It had been defending something. Maybe others like it. Or perhaps something even more disturbing. The realization hit me. I had stumbled into its home. A dark guttural rumble echoed from the trees behind it, and two more shapes emerged, larger, bulkier than the one in front of me. It wasn't alone. They had followed me here, closing in silently, like a pack of wolves. My mind raced. If I stayed, I'd be dead in minutes. But if I ran, there was nowhere to go. The ravine walls were too steep, and my leg was bleeding badly. I couldn't outrun them even if I tried. The largest one stepped forward, its grotesque body shifting in a way that was almost human, yet completely unnatural. Its teeth gleamed in the fading light, but it didn't move to attack. Not yet. It was waiting for something, testing me. And then, out of sheer desperation, I did something stupid. I grabbed a nearby branch, lit it with the lighter I always carried, and waved the makeshift torch in the air. I don't know why I thought it would work. Maybe instinct, maybe panic. But to my surprise, the creatures recoiled, their bodies twitching as the light from the flame flickered over them. They weren't afraid. Not really. But it seemed to confuse them, just enough to make them hesitate. I didn't waste time. With my legs screaming in pain and the fire blazing in my hand, I hobbled backward, keeping the torch between me and them. They followed, stalking me but never getting too close. My heart pounded in my ears, each step feeling like it could be my last. The edge of the ravine was close now, and with every ounce of strength I had left, I scrambled up the steep incline, my fingers digging into the dirt and rocks as I pulled myself out. When I reached the top, I collapsed, panting, the torch still burning weakly beside me. The creatures had stopped at the base of the ravine watching, but they didn't climb after me. They just stood there, their misshapen forms barely visible in the darkness. I could feel their eyes on me, cold and calculating, but they didn't move. It was as if I had crossed some invisible line, one they weren't willing to follow. I lay there for a long time, unable to move, my leg bleeding, my mind spinning. I had lost Scout and I had barely escaped with my life, but more than that, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. I had seen too much, stumbled into something I wasn't supposed to find. Those creatures, they were still out there, lurking, watching, waiting for the next person to make the same mistake I had. Eventually, I managed to limp back to the cabin. The sun was setting by the time I made it, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig made me jump. I kept expecting to see those things emerge from the darkness. The cabin door was still hanging off its hinges, a reminder of the violence that had unfolded earlier. I grabbed my satellite phone, a luxury I rarely used but kept for emergencies. This definitely qualified. With shaking hands, I dialed the sheriff's office. Flathead County Sheriff's Office. A bored voice answered. "This is Frank Holbrook," I said, my voice hoarse. "I'm calling from up near the northern edge of Flathead National Forest. I found a body, or what's left of one." There was a pause on the other end. "Mr. Holbrook, did you say you found a body?" "Yes," I replied, the images of the torn flesh and scattered bones flashing through my mind. It's bad, real bad." "Stay where you are, Mr. Holbrook. We'll send a team out. Can you give me more precise coordinates?" I rattled off the location of my cabin and where I'd found the remains. The deputy assured me they'd be there as soon as possible, but I knew it would be hours. I was a long way from anywhere out here. After hanging up, I set about patching myself up as best I could. The gash on my leg was deep, but the bleeding had slowed. I cleaned it with whiskey. It stung like hell, but it was better than an infection, and wrapped it tightly with a clean cloth. As I worked, my mind kept drifting back to Scout. He'd saved my life. There was no doubt about that. The guilt gnawed at me. I should have left him at the cabin. I should have been faster, smarter, better prepared. But I hadn't been, and now he was gone. The hours crawled by. I sat by the window, rifle in hand, jumping at every sound. The forest seemed alive with menace now, the familiar nighttime noises taking on a sinister quality. What else was out there that I didn't know about? What other secrets did these woods hold? It was well past midnight when I saw the flashing lights coming up the dirt road. 2 police cruisers and an ambulance. I stepped out onto the porch, wincing as I put weight on my injured leg. Mr. Holbrook? A tall, broad-shouldered man in a sheriff's uniform approached. His name tag read, Sheriff Donovan. That's me, I nodded. Mind telling me what happened here? He gestured to the busted door, his eyes narrowing as he took in my battered appearance. I took a deep breath. Like I said on the phone, I found a body, or what was left of it. But there's more to it than that. Over the next hour, I recounted everything that had happened. The body in the woods, the strange tracks, the attack at the cabin, the creatures in the ravine. With each detail, I could see the doubt growing in Sheriff Donovan's eyes. Mr. Holbrook, he said slowly when I'd finished. That's quite a story. But I have to ask, have you been drinking today? I felt a flash of anger. No, damn it. I know how it sounds, but I'm telling you the truth. Donovan held up his hands. All right. Why don't you show us where you found the body? We'll start there. I led them into the woods, my leg protesting with every step. The smell hit us before we saw anything. That same rotten stench from earlier, somehow even worse now. Jesus, one of the deputies muttered, covering his nose. And then we were there. The clearing looked different, in the harsh glare of the police flashlights, but the horror was still evident. The remains were just as I'd left them, scattered in that bizarre circular pattern. Sheriff Donovan's face had gone pale. This is Christ. I've never seen anything like this. The forensics team from the ambulance moved in, photographing and collecting evidence. I stood back, watching as they worked, my mind racing. Would they find anything to corroborate my story? Or would all signs of those creatures be gone? Mr. Holbrook, Sheriff Donovan approached me again. I owe you an apology. Clearly something terrible happened here. But I have to be honest. I'm having a hard time with the rest of your story. These injuries, the tracks you mentioned, all of that could be explained by a bear attack. I shook my head vehemently. No bear did this. I'm telling you, Sheriff, there's something else out there. Something not natural. Donovan sighed. Look, I understand you've been through a traumatic experience, but let's focus on what we know for sure. We have a homicide here, that much is clear. I'm going to need you to come down to the station to give a formal statement. I wanted to argue, to make him understand, but I could see it was useless. I reluctantly agreed to go with Sheriff Donovan to the station. As we walked back to the vehicles, I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. The forest seemed to press in around us, full of hidden threats. The ride to the sheriff's station was long and uncomfortable. My leg throbbed, and every bump in the road sent a fresh wave of pain through me. But worse than the physical discomfort was the growing sense of dread. I knew what I had seen, what I had experienced, but would anyone believe me? At the station, I was led to a small interview room. The walls were a dull beige, adorned only with a large mirror that I assumed was two-way. Sheriff Donovan sat across from me, a tape recorder between us. All right, Mr. Holbrook, he said, pressing the record button. Let's go through this again, from the beginning. I took a deep breath and started my story once more. I described finding the body, the strange tracks, the attack at my cabin. I told him about the creatures in the ravine, their unnatural movements, their horrifying appearance. I recounted how I'd used fire to keep them at bay, how I'd barely escaped with my life. Throughout my retelling, Sheriff Donovan's expression remained neutral, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. Mr. Holbrook, he said finally, I want to believe you, I really do, but you have to understand how this sounds. We have no evidence of these creatures you describe. The forensics team found some unusual tracks, yes, but nothing that couldn't be explained by known wildlife. I felt a surge of frustration. What about the body? The way it was arranged? You can't tell me that was done by any animal you know. Donovan nodded slowly. You're right. The scene was disturbing. But that doesn't mean we're dealing with some unknown species. It's more likely we're looking at a human killer. Someone dangerous. Yes, but human nonetheless. I slumped in my chair, the fight going out of me. What could I say to make him understand? I had seen those things with my own eyes, felt their claws, smelled their foul stench, but without proof. My words were just that. Words. Look, Donovan said, his tone softening. I can see you've been through hell. Why don't you get some rest? We can continue this in the morning. I nodded, too exhausted to argue further. Donovan led me to a small room with a cot. It's not much, he apologized, but it's better than driving all the way back to your cabin tonight. We'll have a doctor look at that leg of yours in the morning, too. As soon as the door closed behind him, the exhaustion hit me like a wave. I collapsed onto the cot, my mind swirling with images of teeth and claws and eyes glowing in the darkness. Despite my fatigue, sleep was elusive. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those creatures, heard their inhuman growls. When I finally did drift off, my dreams were a chaotic jumble of terror. I was back in the ravine, running from shapeless horrors. Scout was there, then gone, his yelps of pain echoing through the trees. I woke with a start, my heart pounding, sweat soaking my clothes. The room was dark, but a sliver of light from under the door told me it was morning. I sat up, wincing at the pain in my leg. The events of the previous day came flooding back, and with them a renewed sense of urgency. Those things were still out there. Maybe they were unique to my little corner of the forest, or maybe they were spreading. Either way, I couldn't just sit here and do nothing. A knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. Mr. Holbrook? It was Sheriff Donovan. Are you awake? The doctor's here to look at your leg. I cleared my throat. Come in. The door opened and Donovan entered, followed by a middle-aged woman in a white coat. This is Dr. Reeves. Donovan introduced her. She's going to check you over. Make sure you're okay. Dr. Reeves approached me with a kind smile. Let's have a look at that leg, shall we? As she examined my injury, cleaning and rebandaging it, Sheriff Donovan filled me in on the investigation's progress. We've identified the victim, he said. A hiker from Oregon, reported missing 2 weeks ago. We're still waiting on full autopsy results, but preliminary findings suggest, well, they're inconclusive. I looked up sharply. Inconclusive? What does that mean? Donovan shifted uncomfortably. The coroner can't determine the cause of death. The injuries are unusual, not consistent with any known animal attack or weapon. A chill ran down my spine. So you believe me now? I believe something strange happened out there, Donovan said carefully. But I'm not ready to jump to conclusions about unknown creatures. We're bringing in some wildlife experts from the state. See if they can make sense of those tracks we found. I nodded, a small spark of hope igniting in my chest. Maybe, just maybe, they'd find something that would prove I wasn't crazy. Dr. Reeves finished her examination and stepped back. The wound is deep but clean, she reported. No signs of infection. I've given you some antibiotics just in case, and painkillers if you need them. Try to stay off that leg for a few days. Thank you, I said. But my mind was already racing ahead. I couldn't stay here. Couldn't sit idle while those things were out there. I needed to go back, to find proof. As if reading my thoughts, Sheriff Donovan spoke up. I know what you're thinking, Mr. Holbrook, and the answer is no. You're not going back out there. Not until we've finished our investigation. I opened my mouth to argue, but he held up a hand. That's not a request. I'm keeping you here for your own safety. We'll have deputies watching your cabin and the surrounding area. If there is something out there, we'll find it. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But as I sat there, the memory of those creatures fresh in my mind, I knew that the sheriff and his deputies weren't prepared for what they might find, and I couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The next few days passed in a haze of frustration and restless energy. I was kept in a small room at the sheriff's station, ostensibly for my own protection, but it felt more like a cell with each passing hour. Sheriff Donovan visited regularly, updating me on the investigation, but there was never any real progress to report. The wildlife experts had come and gone, puzzled by the tracks but unwilling to speculate on their origin. The autopsy results on the hiker's remains were inconclusive, citing unknown trauma as the cause of death. It was maddening. I knew what I had seen, what I had experienced, but without concrete evidence, my story remained just that, a story. On the fourth day, as I paced my small room for what felt like the 1,000th time, Sheriff Donovan entered with a grim expression. "We've got another one," he said without preamble. I felt my blood run cold. "Another what?" "Another body," Donovan replied, his voice heavy. "Found about 5 miles from your cabin. Same condition as the first one." I sank onto the bed, my legs suddenly weak. "It's happening again," I muttered. "They're not stopping." Donovan ran a hand through his hair, looking more shaken than I'd seen him yet. "I don't know what to think anymore, Frank. This doesn't make any sense. We've got the forest crawling with deputies, wildlife officers, even some folks from the FBI. How did we miss this?" I looked up at him, a grim determination settling over me.
Because you don't know what you're dealing with. But I do. I've seen them, Sheriff. I fought them. You need me out there.
Donovan was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the decision. Finally, he nodded. "All right, but you don't leave my sight, understand? And at the first sign of trouble, we're out of there." Relief flooded through me, tinged with a healthy dose of fear. I was going back into those woods, back to where those creatures lurked. But this time, I'd be prepared. The drive back to my cabin was tense. Donovan had insisted on a small team. Himself, 2 deputies, and a wildlife officer named Garrett. We were all armed, though I couldn't shake the feeling that our weapons would be useless against what we might encounter. As we neared my property, I felt a chill run down my spine. The forest seemed different somehow. The shadows deeper, the silence more oppressive. Even the others seemed to feel it, their conversation dying away as we approached. My cabin came into view, looking eerily unchanged since that fateful day. The door had been repaired, I noticed, probably by Donovan's men during their investigation. We piled out of the vehicles, weapons at the ready. "All right," Donovan said, his voice low. "We sweep the area. Stay together, keep your eyes open. Frank, you see anything? Anything at all that looks off, you sing out, 'Clear.'" We all nodded and began our search. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No bird song, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was as if the whole woods were holding its breath. We moved deeper into the trees, towards the ravine where I'd had my terrifying encounter. With each step, the sense of wrongness grew stronger. The air felt thick, almost syrupy, and that faint rotting smell was back, growing stronger as we progressed. Suddenly, Garrett, the wildlife officer, held up a hand. "Tracks," he whispered, pointing to the ground. We all looked where he was indicating. There, in the soft earth, was a print unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It was huge, easily twice the size of a bear print, with long curved claw marks at the tips of what looked like fingers rather than paws. "What the hell made that?" one of the deputies breathed. Before anyone could answer, a low rumbling growl echoed through the trees. We all froze, weapons raised, scanning the forest around us. For a moment nothing moved. Then, from the shadows between 2 massive pines, something emerged. It was just as I remembered. Huge, misshapen, a nightmarish blend of animal features that shouldn't exist together. Its eyes gleamed with an unnatural intelligence as it regarded us. "Oh my God," Donovan whispered beside me. "You were right. You were right about everything." The creature took a step forward, its movements fluid despite its bulk. Behind it, I could see more shapes moving in the shadows. We were surrounded. "Run," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Then louder. "Run." We turned and fled, crashing through the underbrush. Behind us, I could hear the creatures giving chase, their growls growing louder, closer. My heart pounded in my ears as we ran, branches whipping at our faces, roots threatening to trip us with every step. I led the way, my fear giving me speed despite my still healing leg. I knew these woods, knew where we might have a chance. There was an old fire tower not far from here, If we could reach it, climb up, maybe we'd have a chance. This way, I shouted, veering to the left. The others followed, gasping for breath. I could see the tower now, its metal frame rising above the trees. We were going to make it. We had to make it. And then I heard a scream behind me. I turned to see one of the deputies go down, a creature on top of him. Donovan skidded to a halt, raising his weapon. "No," I yelled. "We can't help him. We have to keep moving." For a moment I thought Donovan would ignore me, would try to save his man, but then another creature burst from the trees, and he turned, following me and Garrett towards the tower. We reached the base of the structure, and I all but threw myself at the ladder. "Climb," I shouted. "Climb now!" We scrambled up the metal rungs, the growls and snarls of the creatures growing louder below us. I chanced to look down and immediately wished I hadn't. The clearing around the tower was filled with the things, more than I'd ever seen before. They paced around the base, looking up at us with those terrifyingly intelligent eyes. We reached the top of the tower, slamming the trapdoor shut behind us. For a moment we just stood there, gasping for breath, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. What are those things?" Garrett managed between breaths. I shook my head. "I don't know. I don't think anyone knows, but they're here, they're real, and they're not going away." Donovan moved to the edge of the platform, looking down at the creatures below. "We're safe up here, right? They can't climb?" As if in answer to his question, one of the creatures approached the base of the tower. It looked up at us, and then, to my horror, began to climb. Its claws dug into the metal struts, pulling itself up with terrifying speed. "Oh God," Garrett moaned. "We're trapped." I looked around desperately, searching for anything we could use as a weapon. My eyes fell on an old emergency flare gun, tucked away in a rusty box. "Fire," I said, grabbing the flare gun. "They don't like fire." I aimed down through the metal grating and fired. The flare shot out in a blaze of red light, striking the climbing creature. It let out a horrifying shriek and fell, its body smoldering. The other creatures backed away, their growls turning to whimpers of fear. But I knew it was only temporary. We had bought ourselves some time, but we were still trapped, surrounded by things that defied explanation, things that wanted us dead. As the flare's light faded, plunging us back into the gathering darkness, I couldn't help but wonder, was this how it ended? Trapped in a fire tower, waiting for death to climb up and claim us? Or was this just the beginning of something even worse? The night stretched on, a symphony of inhuman growls and the creaking of metal as the creatures tested the tower's strength. We took turns watching, flare gun at the ready, but they seemed content to wait us out. They knew we had nowhere to go. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I allowed myself a small glimmer of hope. We had survived the night. But as I looked out over the forest, that hope quickly faded. The creatures were still there, dozens of them, surrounding the tower, and in the growing light, I could see something that turned my blood to ice. They were changing. As the sun rose, casting long shadows through the trees, I watched in horrified fascination as the creatures below began to shift and morph. Their bodies seemed to ripple and flow, like clay being molded by unseen hands. Bones cracked and reformed, fur receded and grew in new patterns, and their overall shapes became more human. "What the hell?" Donovan breathed, joining me at the railing. "What's happening to them?" I shook my head, unable to form words. The transformation was grotesque yet mesmerizing. Within minutes, where there had been monstrous, animal-like creatures, there now stood beings that could almost pass for human. Almost, but not quite. Their proportions were still off, limbs too long, faces not quite right, and their eyes still held that predatory gleam. Garrett let out a low whistle. "They're adapting," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and terror, evolving right before our eyes. The implications were staggering. These weren't just animals, weren't just some undiscovered species. They were something else entirely, something that could change its very nature to suit its needs. One of the transformed creatures stepped forward, its movements still fluid but now eerily human-like. It looked up at us, and to my shock it spoke. "Come down," it said, its voice a rasping growl that was barely recognizable as speech. "Talk." Donovan, Garrett, and I exchanged stunned looks. Did that thing just Donovan trailed off, unable to finish the thought. I nodded slowly. It did. It wants us to come down and talk. Well, that's not happening, Garrett said firmly. We're safe up here. Eventually someone will come looking for us. But even as he said it, I could see the doubt in his eyes. We all knew the reality of our situation. We were miles from anywhere, in a part of the forest that was rarely visited. The chances of a random rescue were slim to none. The creature below spoke again. Choose, come down or starve. It was right, of course. We had no food, no water. We couldn't stay in the tower forever. But the thought of facing those things, of putting ourselves at their mercy, it was unthinkable. What do we do? Donovan asked, looking to me. It was strange to see the sheriff, a man used to being in charge, deferring to me. But then, I was the one with the most experience with these creatures, little as that was. I took a deep breath, considering our options. None of them were good. I said slowly, I think I need to go down there. Are you insane? Garrett hissed. They'll tear you apart. I shook my head. I don't think so. If they wanted us dead, they could have torn this tower down by now. They want something else. And we need information. Donovan gripped my arm. Frank, you can't. It's too dangerous. We don't have a choice, I replied. We need to know what we're dealing with. And someone needs to survive to warn others. The gravity of the situation settled over us. We all knew I was right. But that didn't make it any easier. All right, Donovan said finally. But we'll cover you from up here. First sign of trouble, we start shooting. I nodded, grateful for the backup even though I suspected it would make little difference if things went south. I took the flare gun, tucking it into my waistband, and began the climb down. My heart pounded as I descended, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to climb back up to relative safety. But I forced myself to continue, rung by rung, until my feet touched the ground. The creatures, or beings, or whatever they were, formed a loose circle around me. Up close, their human-like appearance was even more unsettling. They were like funhouse mirror reflections of people, everything just slightly off. The one that had spoken stepped forward. He, was taller than the others, with a shock of dark fur or hair that ran down its back. You, it said, pointing at me. You saw us, before. I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. Yes, in the ravine. You killed my dog. The creature tilted its head, an oddly human gesture. Dog, yours. Pack. We understand pack. What are you? I asked, unable to keep the question in any longer. Where did you come from? The creature was silent for a long moment, its strange eyes boring into me. Then it spoke again, its words halting, as if it was still getting used to forming them. We were. Then we were not. Now we are again. I frowned, trying to make sense of its cryptic statement. I don't understand. Were you created by humans? The creature made a sound that might have been a laugh, but it held no humor. Not created. Awakened. Slept long. Very long. Humans woke us. A chill ran down my spine. These things, whatever they were, had been here all along. Dormant, waiting. But what had awakened them? And why now? As if reading my thoughts, the creature continued. Humans dig, drill, poison earth. Woke us. It was starting to make a horrifying kind of sense. The increase in mining and drilling operations in the area over the past few years. The reports of contaminated groundwater. We had done this. We had unleashed these things. What do you want? I asked, dreading the answer. The creature's lips pulled back in what might have been a smile, revealing teeth that were still far too sharp to be human. To live. To grow. To take back what was ours. The implications of its words hit me like a physical blow. These creatures weren't just defending their territory. They were planning to expand, to reclaim what they saw as rightfully theirs. And given their ability to adapt, to evolve rapidly, I didn't see how we could stop them. The people you killed, I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. The hikers. Why? Food, the creature replied simply. And practice. Learning your shapes, your ways. I felt sick. They had been studying us, using the unfortunate hikers as test subjects to perfect their transformations. And now, it seemed, They were ready to move beyond simple imitation. "What happens now?" I asked, though I feared I already knew the answer. The creature's gaze moved past me, to the tower where Donovan and Garrett waited. "Now," it said, "you join us, or you die." I took an involuntary step back. "Join you? What does that mean?" But even as I asked, I saw the change beginning again. The creature's forms began to shift and flow, but this time they weren't becoming more human. They were transforming into something else entirely, something I couldn't even begin to describe. I turned and ran for the tower, screaming for Donovan and Garrett to shoot, to do something, anything, but it was too late. The last thing I saw before the world went dark was a mass of writhing shapes descending upon me. When I awoke, everything had changed. I was different. The world was different, and I knew with a certainty that terrified me to my core, that nothing would ever be the same again. The creatures, my new pack, my new family, gathered around me. I could feel their thoughts, their hunger, their ancient rage at being disturbed. And I could feel something else, something that made my new strange heart race with excitement and fear. I could feel us spreading, growing, evolving, and I knew that this was only the beginning. In the distance I could hear the sounds of civilization cars on a highway, the faint noise of a logging operation. The human world, oblivious to the threat that now lurked in these woods, oblivious to what was coming. As we moved through the forest, our bodies shifting and changing with each step, adapting to our surroundings, I spared one last thought for the man I had been, for Frank Holbrook, for the life I had left behind. And then, with a growl that was part mourning, part anticipation, I let that final piece of humanity go. The hunt was beginning, and the world would never be ready for what was about to emerge from the depths of the Flathead National Forest. As the days wore on, the internal struggle within our collective consciousness intensified. Those of us who had managed to retain some semblance of our humanity began to find each other, forming a sort of resistance within the hive mind. It was a delicate balance. We had to maintain the illusion of conformity while secretly working against the collective's goals. I found myself drawn to others like me, those who remembered their past lives and mourned what they had lost. There was Maria, a former park ranger who had been one of the first to disappear. John, a geologist who had been investigating the strange occurrences in the area. And Sarah, a journalist who had gotten too close to the truth. Together we began to plan. Our first goal was to try and warn the outside world, to stem the tide of pilgrims coming to the forest seeking transformation. But it was a dangerous game. Any overt action risked detection by the collective, and we had all seen what happened to those who openly rebelled. Our opportunity came when a documentary crew arrived in the area, drawn by the stories of miraculous transformations and disappearances. The collective saw this as a chance to spread our influence further, to use the media to attract more willing victims. But we saw it as a chance to get the truth out. I volunteered to be interviewed, to be the face of our movement. The collective agreed, seeing me as one of the more convincing human facades. Little did they know that every word I spoke would be carefully crafted to contain hidden warnings, subtle hints at the horror that lay beneath the surface. The day of the interview dawned clear and cold. I sat across from the interviewer, a young woman named Rebecca, in a clearing that had been carefully staged to look natural and inviting. As the camera rolled, I began to speak, choosing my words with utmost care. "What we offer here is transformation," I said, my voice carrying a hint of the inhuman timbre that was so hard to disguise. "A chance to evolve beyond the limitations of the human form. But it's not a decision to be made lightly. The process is irreversible, and not everyone survives." I saw Rebecca's eyes widen slightly at that last part. Good. She was paying attention. "Those who come here seeking change must be prepared to leave everything behind," I continued. "Their old lives, their families, their very identities. It's a rebirth, in the truest sense of the word." As I spoke, I wove in subtle warnings. I spoke of the hunger that came with transformation, the way it changed not just the body but the mind. I hinted at the loss of free will, the subsumation of individual consciousness into the collective. "We are becoming something greater than human," I said, staring directly into the camera. "But the cost is higher than many realize." I could feel the collective stirring in the back of my mind. a faint sense of unease at my words, but I pressed on, walking the fine line between compliance and rebellion. After the interview, as the crew packed up their equipment, I managed a moment alone with Rebecca. "Be careful," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Don't trust what you see here, and whatever you do, don't stay after dark." She looked at me, confusion and a hint of fear in her eyes. But before she could respond, other members of our group approached, their faces fixed in friendly smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. That night, as the documentary crew slept in their camp on the edge of the forest, we made our move. Maria, John, Sarah, and I snuck into their camp, risking everything to leave them a warning. On a piece of paper, we scrawled a desperate message: "Get out now. What you've seen is a lie. They are not what they seem." We barely made it back to our own encampment before dawn, our hearts racing with the fear of discovery. But we had done it. We had taken the first step in our resistance. The next morning, the documentary crew was gone. They had packed up in the night and fled, leaving behind only a hastily scribbled note thanking us for our time but citing a family emergency that required them to leave immediately. The collective was furious. Suspicion ran rampant, each member scrutinizing the others for signs of betrayal. But in the chaos, our small group of resistors found hope. We had made a difference. We had saved lives. But our victory was short-lived. As the collective's anger grew, so did its determination to root out any dissent. The hunt for traitors began in earnest, and we knew it was only a matter of time before we were discovered. We needed a new plan, something bold enough to disrupt the collective's goals, but subtle enough to avoid detection. And as we huddled together in the deepening twilight, an idea began to form. If we couldn't warn people away, perhaps we could sabotage the transformation process itself. If we could make the evolution less appealing, less successful, maybe we could slow the spread of our infection. It was a dangerous plan, one that would require perfect timing and a great deal of luck. But as I looked at the faces of my fellow resistors, I saw determination and hope. We were ready to risk everything to stop this nightmare. As night fell over the forest, we set our plan in motion, knowing that the fate of humanity might well rest on our success or failure. The battle for the soul of Flathead National Forest, and perhaps the world, had truly begun. Our plan was as simple as it was dangerous. We would tamper with the transformation process, introducing an element of unpredictability that would make the evolution less appealing to potential converts. It was a delicate balance. We needed to create enough failures to discourage newcomers, but not so many that the collective would immediately suspect sabotage. We decided to focus on the initial stages of transformation, the point where new recruits were first exposed to the organism that triggered the change. Maria, with her background in biology, suggested we could potentially alter the organism's DNA, creating a strain that would produce unpredictable and often undesirable mutations. The challenge was gaining access to the transformation site without arousing suspicion. The collective guarded this area zealously, knowing it was crucial to their plans for expansion. But we had an advantage. As trusted members of the group, we were often called upon to guide new recruits through the process. We spent weeks preparing, gathering the materials we needed and perfecting our technique. John's geology expertise proved invaluable as we worked to create a synthetic compound that would interfere with the organism's genetic structure. Sarah used her investigative skills to map out the security protocols around the transformation site, looking for weaknesses we could exploit. Finally, on a moonless night in late autumn, we made our move. I volunteered to be the one to introduce our altered organism into the transformation pool. As one of the elders of our group, I was less likely to be questioned if caught near the site. Heart pounding, I made my way through the dark forest, every snapping twig and rustling leaf sending a jolt of panic through me. The transformation site was located in a deep natural cave system, its entrance hidden behind a waterfall. As I approached, I could hear the low hum of energy that always emanated from the cave, a sound that had once filled me with awe but now only inspired dread. I slipped behind the curtain of water, the spray soaking me to the skin. Inside, the cave was dimly lit by a bioluminescent fungus that coated the walls, casting everything in an eerie blue-green glow. I moved deeper into the cave system, my feet finding the familiar path to the central chamber. The transformation pool lay at the heart of the cave, a perfectly circular body of water that glowed with an inner light. The surface rippled gently, though there was no breeze to disturb it. This was where it all began, where humans were broken down and remade into something other. I approached the edge of the pool, my hand shaking as I reached into my pocket for the vial containing our altered organism. Just as I was about to uncap it, a voice spoke from the shadows. I wondered how long it would take you to make your move. I froze, my heart seeming to stop in my chest. From the darkness emerged a figure I recognized. It was the leader of our group, the one who had first spoken to me that day at the fire tower. But he had changed since then, his form now a nightmarish blend of human and something decidedly not. "Did you really think we wouldn't notice?" he asked, his voice a low growl that echoed off the cave walls. "That we wouldn't feel your resistance, your humanity?" I stood my ground, though every instinct screamed at me to run. "You can't keep doing this," I said, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. "You're destroying people's lives, their very identities." The leader tilted his head, an eerily human gesture on his inhuman face. "We're saving them," he said, elevating them. "You know this, Frank. You've experienced it yourself." "No." I shook my head vehemently. "What you're doing isn't salvation. It's annihilation. You're erasing everything that makes us human." He took a step closer, his form seeming to shift and flow in the dim light. "Humanity is flawed, Frank. Weak. We're offering a chance at true strength, true unity." "At what cost?" I demanded. "Our free will? Our individuality? Our capacity for love, for compassion?" For a moment I thought I saw a flicker of something, doubt, regret, in his inhuman eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "It's too late," he said, his voice tinged with what might have been sadness. "The process has already begun. There's no stopping it now." As he spoke, I became aware of movement in the shadows around us. More figures emerged, their forms twisted and alien. We were surrounded. In that moment, I knew our plan had failed. We had underestimated the collective's awareness, its ability to sense the resistance growing within its ranks. But as I stood there, facing what I was sure would be my end, I felt a strange sense of peace. We had tried. We had fought against the tide of this terrifying evolution. And even if we had failed, we had proven that humanity, true humanity, could not be so easily erased. As the figures closed in around me, I made a final desperate move. With all my strength, I hurled the vial containing our altered organism into the transformation pool. The glass shattered on the surface, the liquid dispersing in ripples across the glowing water. The leader's eyes widened in shock and fury. "What have you done?" he roared, his form contorting in rage. I smiled, a grim satisfaction filling me. "I've given us a fighting chance," I said. And then they were upon me, their bodies engulfing me like a wave. As consciousness slipped away, my last thought was of hope. Hope that somehow, someway, humanity would find a way to survive this nightmare. The darkness took me, but I went willingly, knowing that I had done all I could to resist the spread of this terrifying evolution. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I finally came to, I was no longer in the cave. I found myself lying on the forest floor, the canopy of trees above me, swaying gently in the breeze. For a moment I thought perhaps it had all been a terrible dream, but as I sat up, wincing at the pain that coursed through my body, I knew it had been all too real. My form had changed again, but not in the way I had expected. I looked down at my hands, surprised to see they were almost human again. Almost, but not quite. There was a faint iridescent sheen to my skin, and my fingers were just a bit too long, too flexible. As I struggled to my feet, I became aware of others around me. Maria, John, and Sarah were there, along with dozens of others I recognized from the collective. All of them were in a similar state, caught between human and other, their forms unstable and shifting. "What happened?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Maria approached me, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. "Your sabotage," she said. "It worked, but not in the way we expected. The altered organism, it's changing us again, reverting us, somehow." I looked around, taking in the scene. All throughout the forest I could see others emerging from hiding places, all in various states of transformation. Some were more human, others still largely creature, but all were changing. "The collective?" I asked. John shook his head. "Fractured. The hive mind is gone. We're individuals again, Frank. Confused, scared individuals, but ourselves. I felt a surge of hope, quickly tempered by caution. We weren't out of danger yet, the transformation wasn't complete, and we had no idea what the long-term effects would be. Over the next few weeks, we worked to gather everyone affected by the change. It wasn't easy. Many were scared, confused, some still violent and feral. But slowly we began to form a community. A strange ragtag group of not quite humans, but a community nonetheless. We made contact with the outside world, carefully at first. The story of what had happened in Flathead National Forest was too big to hide, too strange to be easily explained away. The world reacted with a mixture of fear, fascination, and skepticism. Scientists came to study us, government officials to contain us, reporters to expose us. But we stood together, presenting a united front. We were neither fully human, nor the creatures we had been, but something new, something that straddled the line between two worlds. As months passed, we discovered that our new forms came with certain advantages. We were stronger, faster, more resilient than ordinary humans. Some of us developed unique abilities, enhanced senses, rapid healing, even limited shape-shifting. But we had retained our human minds, our memories, our capacity for empathy and love. It wasn't an easy road. There were those who feared us, who wanted us locked away or destroyed. There were others who sought to exploit us, to replicate the transformation for military or commercial gain. But we persevered. We turned the Flathead National Forest into a sanctuary, a place where those like us could live in peace, and where we could carefully control and study the organism that had changed us. We worked with scientists to understand our new biology, and with government officials to establish our rights and protections. As for me, I found a new purpose. I became a bridge between our community and the outside world, working to foster understanding and acceptance. It was a role I never could have imagined for myself in my old life, but one that felt right in this new reality. Years have passed since that night in the cave. The world has changed, adapted to the knowledge that humanity is not alone in its sentience. We are still evolving, still learning about ourselves and our place in the world. There are still mysteries to be solved. We never did discover the true origin of the organisms that changed us, or why they had lain dormant for so long. Sometimes, deep in the forest, I still feel echoes of that alien consciousness that once consumed us. A reminder, perhaps, that the battle is never truly over. But as I stand here looking out over the forest that was once a site of terror and is now a place of hope, I feel a sense of peace. We face the darkness, the horror of losing our very selves, and we emerge changed but unbroken. The evolution that began here was terrifying, yes, but in the end it taught us something profound about what it means to be human. It's not about the shape of our bodies or the structure of our DNA. It's about our capacity for growth, for adaptation, for holding on to our essential selves even in the face of unimaginable change. As the sun sets over the mountains, casting the forest in a golden glow, I smile. The story of Flathead National Forest is far from over. But whatever comes next, we'll face it together, as the strange, wonderful, evolved beings we've become.